At her husband's company gala, the guard glanced at her and said, "Sorry, guests wait outside." She stood there, humiliated, her 2 children beside her. Inside, her husband smirked, leaned close, and whispered, "You wouldn't fit in here anyway." Every other spouse sat proudly beside their partner, but she stood alone, watching him laugh with his assistant. That night, her children saw everything, the insults, the disrespect. Later, when he tried to take them home in his luxury car, both kids shook their heads and said, "We're going with Mom." She quietly unlocked her phone, sent one message to the board, and walked away with her children as his entire world began to unravel. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. May the Almighty breathe peace into your hearts and light your path with his eternal grace. May he wrap your days in comfort, your nights in calm, and your homes in blessings that never end. May every woman walk with the dignity of a queen, every man with the strength of faith, and every child with a spirit pure as morning light. I pray your pain turns into power, your tears into wisdom, and your silence into strength. May love fill your home, may forgiveness heal your heart, and may hope never leave your side. Wherever you go, may angels guide your steps and protect your dreams. If your heart is true, like the video. If your love is real, write, "I am with Mr. Peter." Barbara Norris had ironed his tuxedo 3 times that evening, her hands trembling not from exhaustion, but from hope, the foolish kind that still believed her husband would remember who held his hand when he had nothing. The fabric was perfect now, crisp black shoulders without a single wrinkle. The bow tie she'd spent 20 minutes adjusting until it sat just right. Frederick would look distinguished tonight at the gala celebrating his empire, and maybe, just maybe, he'd look at her the way he used to, the way that made her believe building a life together meant they'd always stand side by side. She'd sewn her own dress for the occasion, navy blue, modest but elegant, with small pearl buttons down the back that Precious had helped her fasten earlier. Her daughter's small fingers had worked each button through its loop while whispering, "Mama, you look like a queen." Barbara had smiled then, kissed the top of Precious's head, and chosen not to mention that queens usually get invited to the palace, not left wondering if there's room for them at the table. The earrings Frederick gave her on their wedding day hung from her ears, simple gold hoops that had cost him 2 weeks. Salary back when 2 weeks' salary meant something because they were building dreams together, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. She touched them now as she stood outside Leonard Industries' grand headquarters, the building that used to have her name on the founding documents before Frederick's lawyers made those papers disappear. The entrance glowed with warm light and cold sophistication. Women in designer gowns she'd seen in magazines glided through the doors on the arms of men in tailored suits. Laughter spilled out into the night air, the kind of laughter that comes easy when you've never had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying your children new shoes. Barbara smoothed her dress one final time and walked toward the entrance. The security guard was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing an expression that suggested he took his job very seriously. His eyes swept over Barbara, cataloguing her modest dress, her simple jewelry. Her face he didn't recognize from the executive floors. "Service entrance is around back," he said, not unkindly, just matter-of-factly. "Catering staff needs to check in with the coordinator first." Barbara's breath caught. I'm Barbara Leonard." Frederick Leonard's wife. The guard's expression didn't change. He consulted his clipboard, running his finger down a list of names. "I don't see you here, Mom. Are you sure you're on the guest list?" "And I'm his wife," Barbara repeated, hating how small her voice sounded. "I don't need to be on a list. I'm family." "Everyone needs to be on the list tonight, ma'am. Company policy for security purposes." He pulled out a radio. "Let me call up to the event coordinator, see if we can sort this out." Barbara stood there as the guard spoke into his radio. As other guests walked past her without a second glance, as the cold night air bit through her dress, She waited for 20 minutes while the guard made calls and checked lists and apologized with increasing discomfort that there seemed to be some kind of mistake. Finally, someone from inside confirmed her identity, and the guard stepped aside with an embarrassed nod. "My apologies, Mrs. Leonard, you can go in." She walked through doors that should have opened for her automatically, past the guard who'd mistaken her for hired help, and into a ballroom that took her breath away for all the wrong reasons. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings like frozen fireworks. Tables draped in ivory cloth held centerpieces of white orchids and flickering candles. A string quartet played in the corner, their music weaving through conversations and clinking champagne glasses. Everything was beautiful, elegant, expensive, a celebration of success that felt like standing in a museum of someone else's life. Barbara's eyes found the main table immediately. Every executive sat with their spouse beside them. Jonathan Richards and his wife Claire, holding hands under the table like newlyweds. David Patterson with his arm around his wife's shoulders, whispering something that made her laugh. Gerald Foster feeding his wife a bite of appetizer, playful and intimate. And there was Frederick, center of the table, commanding attention like he commanded everything now. His tuxedo, the one she'd ironed, fit him perfectly. His smile was bright and confident as he spoke to the people around him, gesturing with the ease of a man who belonged exactly where he was. Next to him sat Simone. She was stunning in the way magazines define stunning. Sharp cheekbones, flawless skin, a red dress that probably cost more than Barbara's monthly grocery budget. Her hand rested on the table dangerously close to Frederick's. She leaned in when he spoke, laughed at his words before anyone else caught the joke, touched his arm with a familiarity that made Barbara's stomach twist, and Frederick's hand, Barbara saw it now, rested on the small of Simone's. Back, casual, comfortable, the way he used to touch. Barbara, when they walked together, when being close to her felt natural as breathing. Barbara's chair was gone. Every other spouse had a seat of honor beside their partner. Every other wife or husband sat at that main table, included, acknowledged, celebrated as part of their partner's success. But Barbara's place didn't exist. She stood there, navy dress and gold hoops, invisible in a room full of people who'd forgotten she was the reason Frederick Leonard had started with anything at all. She moved through the crowd toward the table, her heart pounding against her ribs like it was trying to escape before the rest of her realized what was happening. Frederick looked up, saw her approaching, and something crossed his face that was worse than anger, worse than annoyance, embarrassment. He was embarrassed by her presence. Frederick stood quickly, intercepting her before she reached the table. His hand gripped her elbow, not gently, not the way you touch someone you love, but the way you steer something out of place, back to where it belongs. "What are you doing here?" His voice was low, controlled, the kind of quiet that's more violent than shouting. "It's your gala," Barbara whispered. "I wanted to support you. I wanted to support me." Frederick's laugh was cold. "By showing up looking like someone's schoolteacher and making everyone wonder who let you in." The words hit like physical blows. Barbara felt her face flush hot, her throat closing around responses that wouldn't come. Frederick pulled her further from the table into a corner where the music and conversation covered their words. "You wouldn't fit in here anyway, Barbara. These people speak a language you never learned. They understand ambition, success, excellence. What do you understand? Chalk dust and spelling tests?" "I understand loyalty," Barbara said, her voice shaking. "I understand sacrifice. I understand staying up until 3 in the morning, helping you prepare presentations when you were nobody. I understand. You understand nothing about my world now." Frederick's eyes were hard, distant, like he was looking at a stranger who'd wandered into his life by mistake. "You're an anchor, Barbara. You always have been. I just didn't realize how heavy you were until I started trying to rise." He released her elbow and adjusted his tuxedo jacket, smoothing away the wrinkles their confrontation had created. "Go home. This isn't your place anymore." Frederick walked back to the main table without looking back. He slid into his seat beside Simone, who placed her hand on his arm with a concern that looked practiced and said something that made him smile. The smile Barbara used to believe was only for her. Barbara stood in that corner, in her hand-sewn dress, wearing earrings that had meant forever, and watched the man she'd built everything with laugh, with a woman young enough to be their daughter. She watched every other couple at that table exist in partnership, while she existed in nothing. The coat-check attendant asked if she needed anything. Barbara shook her head and stayed exactly where she was for 2 more hours. She watched Frederick give a speech about determination, about never giving up on your vision, about surrounding yourself with people who elevate you rather than diminish your potential. The room erupted in applause. Simone stood, clapping enthusiastically, her eyes on Frederick like he'd just announced the cure for mortality. Barbara clapped too, slowly, mechanically, the sound of her palms meeting barely audible over the thunder of validation Frederick received from everyone except the woman who'd validated him first. When the gala ended, when the last guests filtered out laughing and drunk and satisfied with their successful evening, Barbara finally moved. She walked through the emptying ballroom, past the wilting orchids and guttering candles, past the security guard who apologized again for the earlier confusion. She walked 32 blocks home in heels that weren't made for breaking. Each step carved blisters into her feet. Each block stretched longer than the last. The city lights blurred around her, buildings and street lamps and late-night restaurants full of people whose marriages weren't disintegrating in slow motion. She didn't cry. Crying required energy she didn't have, emotion she couldn't afford to spend. She just walked, heel strike after heel strike, putting distance between herself and the room where she'd been erased. The house was dark when she arrived. Elias and Precious were asleep, spared the knowledge of what their father had become. Barbara closed the door quietly behind her, removed her heels, and stood in the foyer of the home they'd built together. Photographs lined the hallway. Wedding pictures where Frederick looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. Baby pictures of Elias, then Precious, with both parents glowing with new parent exhaustion and joy. Family vacations to modest beaches where they'd laughed and played and existed as something whole. Barbara walked to the kitchen and sat at the table in the dark. She didn't turn on lights. She didn't make tea. She just sat there, navy dress rumpled now, gold hoops catching faint moonlight through the window, and understood with crystalline clarity that the man in those photographs had died somewhere along the way to success, and the man who'd replaced him didn't love her anymore, might never have, might have only loved what she could, give him until he didn't need her giving anymore. Barbara pulled off her earrings and set them on the table. She stared at them, simple gold circles that used to mean promise, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not breaking. Breaking implied violence, sudden rupture, pain that announces itself with volume. This was quieter. This was the sound of roots pulling free from soil. This was the feeling of chains she hadn't realized she wore finally loosening. This was the moment when a woman who'd spent years building someone else's dream realized she'd forgotten how to dream for herself. Barbara Norris didn't cry that night she planned. Chapter 2. The morning after. Silence. Frederick came home in the early hours before dawn, smelling like expensive whiskey and cheaper perfume. And Barbara was awake, sitting in the dark, waiting not for an apology, but for clarity. She heard his key in the lock, heard him stumble slightly as he entered, heard him curse under his breath when he knocked into the console table in the foyer. The sounds of a man who'd drunk enough to dull his edges, but not enough to forget he had a home to return to. Barbara sat at the kitchen table with papers spread before her, like evidence at a trial. Documents she'd found in Frederick's study while he was at the gala. Papers she'd never been allowed to see. Filed in drawers she'd never been permitted to open. sealed with passwords she'd cracked using her wedding anniversary, a date he apparently still remembered for security purposes, if nothing else. Transfer agreements, revised ownership documents, legal filings that removed her name from properties they'd purchased together, from accounts they'd opened as partners, from the company they'd built with shared sweat and her unacknowledged strategy. Everything systematically erased, her contributions written out of history like she'd never existed. Like the years she'd worked 2 jobs while Frederick got his certifications meant nothing. Like the nights she'd reviewed his proposals and caught his errors, and suggested the angles that won him his first major clients had been fantasies she'd imagined. Frederick appeared in the kitchen doorway, his tuxedo jacket gone, his shirt untucked, his bow tie hanging loose around his neck like a noose he'd slipped. He saw her sitting there, saw the papers. His eyes flickered with something that might have been guilt if guilt lived in him anymore. "You went through my files." Not a question, not an apology, an accusation. "I went through our files," Barbara corrected, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Or what used to be our files before you decided partnership was a liability." Frederick moved to the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of water, drank half of it in one long swallow. Buying time, calculating his response like he calculated everything now, measuring risk versus reward, truth versus convenience. "Those are complicated legal documents," he finally said. "You wouldn't understand the necessity. I wouldn't understand." Barbara's laugh was sharp. "I'm a teacher, Frederick, not an idiot. I understand perfectly. You've been removing me from everything we built together, transferring my shares, refinancing properties in only your name, establishing accounts I have no access to. You've been erasing me. I've been protecting my assets." Frederick set the water bottle down harder than necessary. "Building something significant requires difficult decisions, choices you can't comprehend because you've never operated at this level." This level. Barbara repeated the words like they were foreign. "Ridiculous. You mean the level where you forget your wife exists? Where you leave her standing in a ballroom like unwanted furniture? Where you touch another woman the way you promised to only touch me?" Frederick's jaw tightened. "Simone is my executive assistant. She's professional, ambitious, necessary for the work I do. If you're threatened by competence, I'm threatened by betrayal." Barbara stood, the papers crackling as she gathered them. "I'm threatened by watching the man I married turn into someone who measures people's worth by their usefulness. Tell me, Frederick, when exactly did I stop being useful to you?" The question hung between them, heavy and unanswerable. Frederick's face hardened into the expression she'd come to know too well, the one that meant he was done pretending to care about her feelings, done managing her emotions like they were inconvenient obstacles to his peace. "You want honesty?" His voice dropped to something cruel. "Fine, you stopped being useful when you stopped evolving. When you were content teaching other people's children instead of understanding the world I was building. When you chose comfort over growth. You're stagnant, Barbara. You've been stagnant for years, and I've been dragging you along out of obligation." Obligation. The word tasted like poison. "Is that what our marriage became? An obligation you're eager to dissolve?" "Our marriage became a performance," Frederick said, each word precise as surgery. "Something I maintained for appearance. But you can't even do that right anymore. You showed up tonight looking like a substitute teacher at a Fortune 500 gala. You embarrassed me. You embarrassed yourself. And you exposed exactly why you don't belong in the life I've created." Barbara absorbed the blows, each sentence landing with the weight of finality. This wasn't anger speaking. This wasn't the temporary cruelty of a man who drunk too much and would apologize in the morning. This was truth he'd been holding back, venom he'd stored up, the real feelings he'd hidden under the performance of marriage. She looked at the man standing in their kitchen, wearing the tuxedo she'd ironed, speaking words designed to wound, and she didn't recognize a single part of him. "When did loving you become my biggest mistake?" Barbara asked softly. Frederick met her eyes without flinching. "The day you thought being my wife made you my equal." The silence that followed was absolute. Somewhere upstairs, A floorboard creaked. Neither of them looked up. Neither of them realized that Elias was standing at the top of the stairs in his pajamas, his hand gripping the banister, his face frozen in the expression of a boy watching his father destroy his mother. And in her bedroom, Precious pressed her ear against the door, her young heart breaking in ways that wouldn't heal clean, listening to her father dismantle the woman who'd given him everything. Barbara carefully stacked the papers into a neat pile. Her hands didn't shake anymore. Her voice didn't waver when she spoke. "You think you built this empire alone," she said. "You think your success came from your brilliance, your ambition, your singular vision. But every presentation I edited, every connection I helped you make through my teaching colleagues whose spouses became your clients, every night I held this family together while you chased your dreams. That was me building too. I was the foundation you stood on, Frederick. And you're too arrogant to see that foundations don't crumble when you abandon them. They just stop supporting your weight." Frederick scoffed. "Poetic. Did you rehearse that while you were snooping through my files?" "No," Barbara said. "I realized it while watching you pretend I don't exist, while standing in a room full of couples who still know how to love each other, while walking home alone in the dark because the man I married decided I'm not worth a car ride." She moved past him toward the doorway. The papers clutched against her chest like armor. "Barbara!" Frederick's voice stopped her. She turned, and for a moment, a single, breathless moment, she thought maybe he'd heard himself, maybe he'd seen what he was destroying, maybe he'd remember the man he used to be. "Make sure you're out of the bedroom before I come up," he said. "I need actual sleep tonight, not your pathetic tears." Barbara didn't respond. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step measured and deliberate. She passed Elias on the landing. Their eyes met, and in that glance everything unspoken was understood. Her son's face held rage and heartbreak, and a terrible premature understanding of exactly who his father had become. She touched his shoulder gently as she passed. "Go back to bed, sweetheart. Everything will make sense in the morning." But Elias didn't move. He stood there watching his mother disappear into the guest room, watching his father stumble toward the master bedroom, and understanding that some things would never make sense again. In her room, Precious lay in bed with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars spelled out constellations her father had helped her place there years ago, back when he remembered she existed, back when family meant something more than obligation. She heard her mother close the guest room door, heard her father slam the master bedroom door, heard the house settle into the kind of quiet that follows destruction. And Precious Rosefield Leonard made a decision in that moment, though she wouldn't articulate it for days yet. If she ever had to choose between her parents, between comfort and love, between the palace and the woman who'd built it, she already knew which side she'd stand on. Barbara didn't sleep that night. She sat on the guest room bed with the financial papers spread around her like pieces of a puzzle she'd finally solved. She looked at her wedding photo on the nightstand, young Barbara and young Frederick, smiling like the world was theirs to conquer together. She picked up the frame and stared at it for a long time. Then she opened the nightstand drawer, placed the photo face down inside and closed it. When dawn finally came, painting the guest room in shades of grey and gold, Barbara Norris stood and walked to the closet. She pulled out a suitcase she hadn't used in years, set it on the bed, and began folding clothes with the precision of someone who had already left in her heart. This was the morning everything changed. This was the moment. Calculation became action. This was the day Barbara stopped being Frederick Leonard's wife and started becoming herself again. Chapter 3. The Choice That Broke Him. Frederick assumed his children would choose the mansion with the pool, the private school with the prestige, the life where money solved every problem except the one that mattered. He forgot they had her heart. The sound of Barbara packing woke the house. Not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet rustle of clothes being folded, drawers opening and closing, hangers sliding across rods. The sound of departure in its earliest stages, before tears, before drama, just practical preparation for survival. Frederick emerged from the master bedroom near noon, his face puffy from alcohol and restless sleep. His expensive pajamas wrinkled in ways his tuxedo never would be. He found Barbara in their bedroom. No, his bedroom now, he'd made that clear, carefully removing her clothes from the walk-in closet. A single suitcase sat open on the bed. Not the large designer luggage they'd purchased for the European vacation they never took because Frederick was always too busy. Just a simple black bag, medium-sized, the kind that fits in an overhead compartment because economy passengers don't get checked luggage privileges for free. "What are you doing?" Frederick's voice carried more irritation than concern, like she was rearranging furniture without consulting him rather than dismantling their marriage. "Leaving," Barbara continued, folding a sweater, creasing it precisely down the middle. "I think you made that decision for both of us last night. I'm just executing what you clearly wanted." Frederick laughed, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "You're leaving. Where exactly do you think you're going? You have no job, no savings, no—" "I have my sister." Barbara placed the sweater in her suitcase. "I have Lydia's guest room. I have my teaching certification. I have everything I need except self-respect if I stay here." "Fine." Frederick shrugged, the gesture casual, dismissive. "Go, run to your sister. Play the victim. But understand this, Barbara. Elias and Precious stay here." Barbara's hands stilled on a blouse she'd been folding. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." Frederick moved further into the room, his posture straightening into the boardroom stance he used when negotiating deals. "The children remain in this house, in their school, in their life. You don't get to disrupt them because you're having some kind of emotional crisis." Emotional crisis. Barbara turned to face him fully. "Is that what you call realizing your husband despises you? Is that what you call discovering you've been systematically erased from your own life? Call it whatever helps you sleep at night." Frederick's eyes were cold, calculating. "But those kids have comfort here, stability, opportunity. You think you can provide that in your sister's apartment? You think you can give them what I can?" The bedroom door opened. Elias stood in the doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour, his expression unreadable. "Are you really leaving, Mom?" Barbara's voice softened immediately. "Sweetheart, don't answer him," Frederick interrupted. "Elias, your mother is upset right now. She's making rash decisions that she'll regret. You don't need to worry about any of this." Elias ignored his father completely, his eyes locked on Barbara. "If you're leaving, what happens to us?" Frederick stepped forward, placing a hand on Elias's shoulder with performative paternal concern. "You stay here, son, where you belong, where you have everything you need." "I didn't ask you." Elias shrugged off his father's hand with a deliberateness that made Frederick's jaw tighten. "I asked Mom." Barbara moved toward her son, kneeling slightly so they were eye level. "You don't have to choose, Elias. You don't have to decide anything right now. I will always be your mother, always love you, no matter where any of us live." "That's a cop-out answer," Elias said, but his voice wasn't angry. It was searching, trying to understand the rules of a game that shouldn't exist. "You're either taking us with you or you're not. Which is it?" Frederick interjected before Barbara could respond. "She's not taking you anywhere. You're old enough to understand that this house, your school, your future, all of that costs money your mother doesn't have. I can give you opportunities she can't, college funds, connections, the kind of life that opens doors instead of begging at them." Opportunities. Elias repeated the word like it tasted rotten. "Is that what you call what you did to Mom last night? An opportunity for her to know exactly how little she means to you?" Frederick's face flushed. "You don't understand adult relationships." "I understand enough." Elias's voice shook, not with fear, but with fury carefully controlled. "I understand you humiliated her. I understand you've been lying to all of us. I understand that everything you taught me about being a man, about integrity and respect and keeping your word, you don't believe any of it. You just said it because it sounded good. Elias, Frederick reached for his son again. Don't touch me. The words came out sharp, final. You taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns. That character matters more than comfort. That family comes first, always. Were those lies? Was everything you said just garbage you performed until you got rich enough to stop pretending? The room fell silent except for the sound of Frederick's breathing, heavy and defensive. Your father is under a lot of pressure. Barbara tried to mediate, even now, even after everything. Running everything, managing people, the stress. Stop defending him, Mom. Elias turned to her, his eyes fierce. He doesn't defend you. He doesn't protect you. He threw you away like trash in front of people who probably don't even remember your name. Why are you still making excuses for him? Barbara had no answer. Her son, barely old enough to drive, had just articulated the question she'd avoided for years. The bedroom door opened wider. Precious stood there in her school uniform, her backpack already on her shoulders, her hair in the neat braids Barbara had taught her to do herself. She looked so small in the doorway, so young, but her eyes held something ancient and knowing. Are we leaving, Mama? Her voice was quiet, certain. Like the answer was already decided. Precious, honey, you don't have to, Barbara started. We're not going anywhere. Frederick cut in, his voice hardening. Precious, you love this house. You love your room, your friends, your dance classes. Your mother can't give you any of that. She can't give you anything but struggle. Precious walked into the room, her small feet making almost no sound on the plush carpet Frederick had custom installed last year. She stood between her parents, looking up at her father with eyes that held heartbreak, too mature for someone so young. You didn't come to my last dance recital. Daddy! Frederick blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. I had a meeting, sweetheart. I explained. You didn't come to the one before that either, Precious continued, her voice steady. Or to my school play, or to parent-teacher conferences. Mama comes to everything. Mama knows my teacher's name. Mama knows what I'm learning, who my friends are, what makes me scared at night. You don't know any of that. You just know that dance classes cost money, and you're the one who pays for them. Precious, that's not fair. You said Mama embarrassed you last night, Precious interrupted. You said she doesn't belong in your world anymore. But Mama is my world. She's the only part of this house that feels like home. Everything else is just stuff. Pretty stuff. Expensive stuff. But stuff doesn't hug you when you have nightmares. Stuff doesn't help you with homework or make you soup when you're sick. Mama does that. You just pay for stuff and think that's the same thing as being a father. Frederick's face had gone pale. I provide everything for you. Everything you have, everything you are. I'm not here because of what you provide, Precious said. I'm here because Mama made me feel like I matter. You make me feel like I cost too much. The silence that followed was devastating. Barbara's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Elias looked at his little sister with a mixture of pride and grief. Frederick stood frozen, his carefully constructed arguments disintegrating under the honest assessment of a child who'd seen more than he'd realized. Frederick's voice, when he finally spoke, came out desperate, grasping. I can buy you a car, Elias, when you turn 17. Any car you want. And Precious, that trip to Europe you wanted? We'll go next summer. We'll tour Paris, London, Rome, whatever you want. You can't buy what you already broke, Daddy. Precious's voice cracked on the word Daddy, like even saying it hurt now. Frederick turned to Barbara, his expression shifting to something harder, more vicious. This is your fault. You turned them against me. You poisoned them. I didn't have to poison anyone, Barbara said quietly. You did this yourself. With every missed dinner, every broken promise, every time you chose work over showing up. I didn't turn them against you, Frederick. I just caught them when you let them fall. Elias moved to stand beside his mother. The symbolism wasn't subtle. His choice made physical, his body positioning itself on her side of an invisible line drawn down the center of the room. I'm going with Mom, he said. Wherever she goes. Whatever that looks like. Frederick's voice rose, control slipping. You're a minor. You don't get to make that decision. Legally, I can... Legally, I can walk out this door, Elias shot back. And I will. Every single day. You can drag me back here, but you can't make me stay. You can't make me respect you. You can't force me to forget what you did to the woman who sacrificed everything so you could become someone who thinks sacrifice is weakness. Precious took her mother's hand. I choose Mama too. I already packed my favorite things last night. They're in my backpack. Barbara looked down at her daughter. This tiny girl carrying a backpack that suddenly represented everything meaningful in her life, and something inside her chest both shattered and healed simultaneously. You don't have to do this, Barbara whispered to both children. I will love you exactly the same, no matter what you choose. This isn't about taking sides. Yes, it is, Elias said. It's always been about sides. We just didn't realize it until now. And we're choosing love over money. We're choosing the parent who shows up over the parent who just sends checks. We're choosing you, Mom. We already did. Frederick looked at his family, his wife, his son, his daughter, all standing together on one side of the room while he stood alone on the other. He saw his empire reflected in their eyes, saw his success measured by their rejection, saw the cost of his ambition totaled in the space between them. You'll be back, he said, his voice hollow but stubborn. When you realize how hard it is out there, when you run out of money and options and fantasy notions about love conquering all, you'll come back. And I won't be waiting with open arms. Barbara picked up her suitcase. We won't be coming back. We don't need everything, Precious said, squeezing her mother's hand tighter. We just need each other. They walked out of the bedroom together, Barbara, Elias, and Precious, leaving Frederick standing among designer furniture and custom carpeting and all the expensive emptiness he'd chosen over them. Frederick watched them descend the stairs, heard the front door open and close, heard the car start, Barbara's old sedan that he'd been planning to replace with something newer, something that wouldn't embarrass him in the driveways of his colleagues. He stood at the bedroom window and watched them drive away, certain they'd realize their mistake within days. He was wrong. They never came back, and Frederick Leonard stood in his empty mansion, surrounded by everything he'd gained and nothing that mattered, finally understanding the difference. Chapter 4. The Weight of New Beginnings. Barbara's sister's apartment was 1,700 square feet smaller than their old house, but for the first time in years, they could breathe without permission. The building stood in a neighborhood Frederick would have called transitional, with the kind of disdain people use when they mean poor but want to sound diplomatic. Lydia lived on the 3rd floor, accessible only by stairs that creaked protest with every step. The hallway smelled like someone's cooking, spices Barbara couldn't name, but that made her stomach growl despite the knot of anxiety living there permanently now. Lydia opened the door before Barbara could knock, like she'd been watching through the peephole waiting for them. She was older than Barbara by 4 years, greyer by circumstance, divorced by choice, and more genuinely happy than anyone Barbara had seen in the circles Frederick travelled. "Get in here," Lydia said, pulling Barbara into a hug that lasted long enough to matter. "Took you long enough to wake up." They entered the apartment in a single-file line that felt like refugees seeking asylum. Ildis carried the suitcase. Precious clutched her backpack like it contained crown jewels instead of stuffed animals and sketch pads. Barbara carried nothing but exhaustion and the terrifying freedom of having finally chosen herself. The apartment was small but lived in, filled with mismatched furniture and photographs of people who smiled because they wanted to, not because cameras required it. Plants thrived on every available surface. Books stacked in corners like small literary towers. The television was old but functional. The couch had seen better decades, but offered comfort anyway. "You'll take my room," Lydia said, already moving toward the hallway. "I'll sleep on the couch." "Absolutely not," Barbara protested. "We're already imposing. Your family, not imposing. And I've been falling asleep watching television for the past 2 years anyway. Might as well make it official." Lydia pointed at Elias and Precious. "You two will share the second bedroom. It's got bunk beds left over from when my kids lived here." Top bunk is prime real estate, by the way. Battle it out amongst yourselves. Precious's eyes lit up for the first time since they'd left the mansion. Bunk beds? Really? Really. And the bottom bunk has a reading light, so don't let your brother convince you the top is better just because it's higher. Elias managed a small smile, the first crack in the stoic armor he'd worn since the confrontation with his father. I'll take bottom bunk. Heights aren't my thing anyway. They settled in with the awkward efficiency of people trying not to burden each other. Barbara insisted on taking the couch despite Lydia's protests. Elias and Precious unpacked their minimal belongings into a bedroom approximately the size of Precious's walk-in closet at home. No one complained. No one mentioned what they'd left behind. They moved forward because backward wasn't survivable. That first night, Barbara lay on Lydia's couch, staring at a ceiling with a water stain shaped vaguely like a bird, and conducted a mental inventory of her resources. Cash on hand, $234. Savings account, $3,166. The account Frederick had forgotten existed because he'd stopped caring about Barbara's finances years ago. Credit cards, none that Frederick couldn't freeze with a single phone call. Job prospects, teaching positions that wouldn't materialize mid-semester without connections she no longer had access to. Debts. None, thankfully, except the unpayable kind owed to children who'd sacrificed comfort for love. The mathematics of survival felt impossible. Morning came too soon and too late simultaneously. Barbara woke to sunlight streaming through windows without curtains expensive enough to block it perfectly. She smelled coffee. Real coffee, not the specialty bean imported nonsense Frederick had insisted on, and followed the scent into Lydia's tiny kitchen. "How'd you sleep?" Lydia asked, pouring Barbara a mug without waiting for an answer. "I didn't," Barbara admitted. But lying down felt productive anyway. Lydia slid the mug across the small table. "What's your plan?" "That survived today. Reassess tomorrow. Repeat until it feels less terrifying." "Solid plan." Lydia sat across from her. "It can cover rent and groceries for a few weeks while you figure things out. No arguments. I watched what that man did to you for years. Consider it back payment for every time I bit my tongue instead of telling you to leave." Tears threatened, but Barbara blinked them back. Crying felt like luxury she couldn't afford. "Thank you for everything. For not saying, 'I told you so.'" "The day isn't over yet," Lydia said with a grin that made Barbara laugh despite everything. Elias emerged next, already dressed for school, his face carefully blank in the way teenagers mask panic. "How do I get to school from here?" Barbara's heart sank. She hadn't thought about transportation, about the logistics of maintaining normalcy when everything had imploded. "I'll drive you. It's 40 minutes, but that's almost an hour of gas every day," Elias said quietly. "Gas you need money to buy." The unspoken math hung between them, brutal in its honesty. "Maybe I should transfer schools," Elias suggested. "Somewhere closer. The district school is probably fine." "Your senior year," Barbara started, "doesn't matter if it bankrupts us." Elias's voice was matter-of-fact. "Practical, too adult for someone who should still be worried about nothing heavier than college applications. I can transfer, make new friends. It's fine." It wasn't fine, and they both knew it. But fine was a luxury they'd given up when they chose love over money. Precious appeared in the doorway, her school uniform slightly wrinkled from being packed in a backpack. "Can we eat breakfast?" "Of course, baby." Barbara moved toward the kitchen, mind racing through the inventory of Lydia's pantry, the cost of groceries, the mathematics of feeding 2 growing children on a budget that didn't exist. They ate cereal, generic brand, perfectly adequate around Lydia's small table, and Barbara watched her children adapt in real time to a life without abundance. Elias took a normal-sized portion instead of his usual overflowing bowl. Precious didn't complain about the lack of fresh fruit. They existed in the gap between old life and new reality, with a grace that broke Barbara's heart, even as it filled her with pride. After breakfast, Barbara drove the children to school in her old sedan that rattled slightly at high speeds and needed an oil change she couldn't afford yet. The silence in the car was heavy with unspoken questions. How long will this last? Did we make the right choice? Will we be okay? Barbara couldn't answer any of them honestly. She dropped Precious at her school first, watching her daughter walk toward the building with her head high despite wearing yesterday's uniform. Then Elias, who squeezed her shoulder before exiting the car, a gesture of comfort flowing the wrong direction. Child reassuring parent when it should be the other way around. Alone in the car, Barbara sat in the parking lot and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to panic. 3 minutes to feel the weight of responsibility crushing her chest, to calculate impossible math, to wonder if she'd destroyed her children's lives by prioritizing dignity over stability. 3 minutes. Then she dried her eyes, pulled out of the parking lot, and drove to the community center she'd passed on the way to Lydia's apartment. The building was old but maintained, painted cheerful yellow with a garden out front that someone actually tended. A bulletin board near the entrance displayed flyers for various programs: ESL classes, job training, youth sports, senior activities, and one small notice at the bottom: volunteer tutors needed for after-school program. Contact director inside. Barbara stepped inside. The director was a woman named Constance, who looked tired in the way people who care too much always do. She explained the program in air quotes Barbara could hear. 5 kids whose parents worked late hours. No structure, no curriculum, just a basement room where they waited until pickup. I can help, Barbara said. I'm a teacher, elementary and middle grades. I have my certification, references. You want to volunteer? Constance looked suspicious, like generosity was a scam she hadn't identified yet. I need to work, Barbara corrected. But I understand there might not be budget for paid positions right now. So I'll volunteer until there is. I need somewhere to be. Something to do that matters. Constance studied her for a long moment. You running from something? Yes, Barbara answered honestly. But I'm running towards something too. I just don't know what it looks like yet. Okay. Constance stood, extending her hand. Monday through Friday, 3 to 6. Bring whatever you need for teaching. We'll provide space. Can't promise much else. Barbara shook her hand, feeling purpose solidify for the first time since leaving the mansion. Space is enough. For now, space is everything. She returned to Lydia's apartment and spent the afternoon creating lesson plans with borrowed paper and pens she'd saved from her old teaching days. She organized activities, planned reading strategies, sketched out schedules. She built structure from nothing because structure was all she knew how to build anymore. When Elias and Precious came home from school, Barbara was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by her planning materials. What's all this? Precious asked, climbing into the chair beside her mother. I found a job, sort of. Tutoring at the community center. It doesn't pay yet, but it's something. Something is good, Elias said, dropping his backpack by the door. Better than nothing. I talked to the school office, Elias continued, about work-study programs. There's a grocery store near here that hires students. They'll work around my schedule. Elias, you don't have to. Yes, I do, he interrupted gently. We're a team now, Mom. Teams support each other. That's what you taught me. Precious pulled out her sketch pad. And I can help Aunt Lydia with her baking on weekends. She said I'm good at decorating cupcakes. Barbara looked at her children, these remarkable humans who'd chosen struggle alongside her instead of comfort without her, and understood that wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts. We're going to be okay, she said, believing it for the first time. We already are, Precious said simply, returning to her drawing. That night, they ate dinner Lydia had cooked. Simple pasta, sauce from a jar, bread from the discount bakery, and laughed about stupid things that didn't matter. They played board games with missing pieces. They watched television on a screen small enough to actually require sitting close together. They existed in cramped quarters without space to escape each other. and discovered that proximity wasn't punishment when you actually loved the people you were close to. Barbara tucked Precious into the bottom bunk, kissed her forehead, and listened to her daughter whisper, "I miss my room sometimes, but I don't miss the house." Does that make sense? Not perfect sense, baby. Buildings aren't homes. People are. Later, lying on Lydia's couch in the dark, Barbara heard her phone buzz. A text from Frederick's lawyer. Legal papers would arrive soon regarding custody arrangements, asset division, official dissolution of marriage. She deleted it without responding. Tomorrow, she'd worry about lawyers and papers and the brutal formality of ending what was already dead. Tonight, she'd sleep on her sister's couch, knowing her children were safe, fed, and learning that love without luxury was still love, maybe even the purest kind. Barbara closed her eyes and dreamed of classrooms filled with children who needed her, of building something from nothing, of foundations that held steady because they were built on purpose instead of pride. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its evening rhythms, and somewhere across town, Frederick sat in his empty mansion, wondering when his family would realize their mistake and come home. They never would. But he wouldn't understand that until much, much later. Chapter 5. Roots Deeper Than Riches. Barbara learned that empire building looks different when you're not trying to conquer. It looks like 8-year-old hands finally learning to read, like mothers crying grateful tears, like building something that can't collapse because it's held up by love. The community center's basement room smelled like old carpet and possibility. 5 children sat on metal folding chairs when Barbara arrived for her first day, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion of kids who've been parked somewhere to wait, while adults handle adult things. They ranged in age from 7 to 13, unified only by circumstance. Parents who worked evening shifts, grandparents who couldn't manage the energy, older siblings who'd aged out of caring. These were the leftover children, the ones who fell through gaps in systems designed for families that looked different than theirs. Barbara set down the box of supplies she'd assembled from dollar store finds and library donations. Workbooks, pencils, construction paper, crayons that had seen better days but still made color. Small treasures that became significant when you understood their scarcity. "Hi, everyone. I'm Mrs. Norris. I'll be spending afternoons with you from now on." The oldest boy, name tag reading Jerome, slouched deeper in his chair. "Another volunteer who'll quit in a week. Cool." "Maybe," Barbara acknowledged, refusing to promise what she couldn't guarantee. "Or maybe I'll still be here when you graduate high school. Either way, today we're here together. So let's make it count." She started with introductions, learned names and favorite subjects, and the small details that make children feel seen. Jamal loved dinosaurs. Sheila wanted to be a veterinarian but couldn't spell it. Daniel read at a kindergarten level despite being older. Yolanda drew constantly, beautiful sketches that suggested talent without training. And Jerome, the skeptic, loved history, but pretended not to care about anything. Barbara adapted her curriculum instantly, pulling lesson threads from their interests rather than imposing structure they'd resist. She turned Jamal's dinosaur obsession into a paleontology unit. She had Sheila research animal medicine, teaching spelling through passion. She worked with Daniel one-on-one, patient and encouraging, celebrating tiny victories like decoding 3-letter words. Precious arrived after her own school let out, skipping into the room with art supplies she'd carried all day. "Can I help, Mama?" The children perked up, curious about this addition to their afternoon. "This is my daughter, Precious. She's going to work with anyone interested in art projects." Precious beamed, already spreading out paper and markers. "Who wants to draw their favorite animal? I'll show you how to add details that make them look real." Yolanda gravitated toward Precious immediately. 2 artists recognizing kinship. Within minutes, they were sketching together. Precious demonstrating shading techniques she'd learned in expensive art classes she'd never mentioned to kids who'd never had them. Elias appeared an hour later, still wearing his grocery store uniform, Exhaustion evident but determination stronger. Sorry I'm late, Mom. Shift ran over. What do you need? Barbara's heart squeezed watching her son, who should be playing sports or video games, instead volunteering to help after working for minimum wage because they needed every dollar. Jerome's working on a history project about the civil rights movement. You took that unit recently. Think you could help him research? Elias dropped his backpack and pulled up a chair beside Jerome, who immediately bristled at the intrusion. I can do it myself. I know, Elias said easily. But sometimes having someone to bounce ideas off makes the work better. You pick the topic. I'll just listen and help you find sources. Deal? Jerome studied Elias suspiciously, looking for the catch, the superiority, the judgment. Finding none, he relaxed incrementally. Fine, but I'm writing it. I don't need you to do my work. Wouldn't dream of it. Barbara watched her children integrate seamlessly into this makeshift classroom. Watch them give freely of energy they didn't have. Watch them understand, without being told that teaching isn't about superiority. It's about scaffolding others toward their own potential. The weeks accumulated into patterns. Barbara arrived at the center every afternoon, with lessons planned around donated materials, and creativity stretched thin. Enrollment grew from 5 children to 12, then 17, then 25 as word spread through the neighborhood about the teacher who actually cared, who showed up consistently, who saw potential instead of problems. Parents began staying after pickup, asking questions about their children's progress, expressing gratitude Barbara hadn't earned yet, but appreciated anyway. Mrs. Norris, Sheila's reading at home now, one mother said, her voice thick with emotion. She hates reading, hated it, but she's reading now, every night. How did you do that? I didn't do anything, Barbara said honestly. Sheila decided she wanted to. I just provided books about animals she couldn't resist. The community center director, Constance, appeared in the doorway one afternoon 6 weeks into Barbara's volunteer tenure. Can we talk? Barbara's stomach dropped. This was it. The moment they'd decide one volunteer teacher wasn't worth the space, wasn't producing measurable results fast enough, We got a small grant, Constance interrupted Barbara's spiral. Not much, but enough to pay you. It's part-time, barely minimum wage, but if you're interested... Yes. Barbara's response came before Constance finished the sentence. Absolutely yes. You didn't let me tell you the amount. Doesn't matter. If it's legal and covers gas money, I'm in. Constance smiled, tired but genuine. You're either desperate or dedicated. Haven't decided which yet. Both, Barbara admitted. Desperately dedicated. The paycheck wasn't much. $400 every 2 weeks. Poverty wages for professional work. Barbara had never been more grateful for money in her life. It meant food security. It meant not leaning entirely on Lydia. It meant dignity earned through labor instead of granted through marriage. She cashed her first check at a corner store that charged 3% but offered immediate access. Then took Elias and Precious to the grocery store they'd been avoiding because their list always exceeded their budget. Get actual food, Barbara said, steering them toward produce instead of bargain aisles. Nothing we don't need, but nothing we do need that we're skipping. They shopped like it was treasure hunting. Elias comparing unit prices with calculator focus. Precious selecting vegetables and asking how to prepare them. Barbara allowing herself the luxury of meat that wasn't marked down for quick sale. At checkout, the total came to $67. Barbara had expected panic. Instead, she felt pride, honest money, honestly earned, feeding people she honestly loved. They loaded groceries into Barbara's car, the old sedan that rattled but ran, that embarrassed nobody because it represented transportation instead of status. Elias arranged bags carefully in the trunk, ensuring nothing would shift during the drive. Precious claimed the front seat, already chattering about dinner plans. Barbara started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing. Healing took longer than weeks, but the beginning of understanding that poverty with purpose felt richer than wealth without meaning. They drove through the neighborhood as evening fell, streetlights flickering on, people walking home from work or sitting on stoops watching the world pass. This wasn't the neighborhood Frederick would have chosen. These weren't the views he'd have valued. But these were the streets where Barbara was building something that couldn't be purchased. Community, contribution, the quiet knowledge that she mattered because she made others feel like they mattered. "Mom," Elias said from the back seat, "there's smoke coming from the car hood." Barbara's heart sank. She pulled over immediately, killed the engine, and got out to investigate. Steam, not smoke, rising from the radiator like accusatory judgment. She popped the hood, stared at machinery she didn't understand, and felt the familiar weight of problems without solutions. Engine overheating. A voice came from the sidewalk. Barbara turned. An older man stood near a garage, wiping his hands on a rag, his face weathered but kind. "I think so. I don't really know much about cars." The man approached, glanced under the hood, and made a considering sound. "Radiator fluids low. Probably a leak somewhere. You got far to go?" "Just a few blocks. Let it cool down 15 minutes, then drive straight there. Don't turn the engine off until you're parked. Bring it to my shop tomorrow, right here, and I'll take a look." "Name's Walter. I can't really afford—" Barbara started. Walter waved her off. "Didn't ask if you could. Asked if you wanted it fixed. Everything costs something, but prices vary. We'll figure it out." Gratitude threatened tears Barbara refused to shed in front of strangers. "Thank you. I'll come by tomorrow." They waited the 15 minutes sitting on a nearby bus bench, Precious asking questions about engines and Barbara admitting she didn't have answers. When they finally drove the last few blocks to Lydia's apartment, the car shuddered but survived. Inside, Lydia had dinner started, rice and beans, simple and filling. They unloaded groceries, and Barbara contributed fresh vegetables to add to the meal, protein to make it substantial, fruit for dessert because children deserved sweetness sometimes. They ate together around the small table that barely fit 4 people, but somehow accommodated them perfectly. They talked about their days, Elias's co-worker drama at the grocery store, Precious's improving art skills, Barbara's expanding tutoring program, Lydia's successful weekend at the farmer's market selling baked goods. After dinner, Precious helped with dishes, while Elias tackled homework at the table. Barbara sat with Lydia on the couch, exhausted but content in ways exhaustion from Frederick's life never allowed. "Your car making that noise again?" Lydia asked. "Radiator. Found a mechanic who might not completely bankrupt me. Walter. Good guy, honest, he'll charge you fair." Lydia paused. "You're doing good, you know. Building something real. Something that'll last because it's built right." Barbara nodded, not trusting her voice. That night, lying on the couch in the dark, Barbara thought about the article she'd read that afternoon. A small piece in the local paper about the community center's expanded programming, mentioning her by name. Barbara Norris brings dedicated teaching experience to underserved youth. It was tiny, insignificant to anyone who measured success by square footage and salary. But to Barbara, seeing her name attached to work that mattered, to contribution that helped rather than merely impressed, felt like the first true recognition she'd received in years. She'd taped that article to Lydia's refrigerator, not from pride, but as proof that starting over was possible. That significance came from service, that empires built on love instead of ego had foundations nothing could shake. Across town, Frederick sat in his mansion reading the same article. He'd found it accidentally while searching for something else, seen Barbara's name, read about her community work, and felt something he refused to name as regret. He crumpled the paper, threw it toward the recycling bin, missed, left it on the floor, where hired cleaners would find it the next day. He poured whiskey into crystal glasses and told himself his ex-wife's small achievements meant nothing, affected nothing, threatened nothing. He was lying to himself, but he'd become excellent at that. Meanwhile, Barbara slept soundly on her sister's couch, dreaming of classrooms and children and the quiet satisfaction of work that actually mattered, completely unaware that the man she'd left behind was beginning the slow process of unraveling. Some collapses happen suddenly. Others take time, brick by brick, decision by decision, until the structure that seemed so solid proves itself hollow. Frederick's collapse was just beginning, and he had no idea how far he'd fall before hitting something solid enough to hold his weight. Chapter 6, The Empires. First cracks, Frederick Leonard discovered that loyalty, purchased with paychecks, disappears the moment the checks get smaller, and Simone's devotion lasted exactly as long as his quarterly profits. The audit notification arrived on a Tuesday morning. Clinical and bureaucratic in its language. Routine financial review. Standard procedure. Please provide documentation for accounts, ending in various numbers that Frederick didn't immediately recognize, because he delegated those details to people he'd trusted to handle them, people like Simone. She'd been handling his financial oversight for some time, managing accounts with access he'd granted because she was competent, beautiful, and told him what he wanted to hear. She worked late hours Frederick mistook for dedication. She accompanied him to dinners he called networking, and she probably called something else. She'd filled spaces Barbara had vacated, both professionally and in the dangerous territory of implications neither of them had made explicit. Frederick called her into his office. The notice spread on his desk like evidence of something he hadn't yet understood. "Did you know about this audit?" He kept his voice casual, not yet suspicious, just seeking information. Simone's expression remained perfectly neutral. "Audits are standard. Nothing to worry about. I'm sure everything will check out fine. These account numbers," Frederick pointed at the list. "What are these for specifically?" "Client trust accounts, operational reserves, standard holdings. I can pull the documentation if you'd like to review it." "Do that," Frederick said. "By end of day. I want everything organized before they start digging." Simone nodded, left his office with the same confidence she always carried, and Frederick thought nothing more of it until the auditor arrived the following week and started asking questions. Nobody could answer because the answers had apparently left the building. The auditor was a woman named Patricia who wore sensible shoes and an expression that suggested she'd seen every financial trick humans had invented and wasn't impressed by any of them. She set up in Frederick's conference room with boxes of files Simone had provided, and within 4 hours, Patricia's expression had shifted from neutral to concerned. "Mr. Leonard, can you explain these transfer patterns?" She showed him spreadsheets with highlighted rows, numbers that should have stayed in one column, but had apparently taken detours through several others before disappearing entirely. Frederick stared at numbers that meant nothing, following trails that led nowhere. "What am I looking at?" Money leaving your client trust accounts in increments just below reporting thresholds, routing through intermediate accounts, then disappearing into what looks like personal holdings that don't match your declared assets. That's impossible. Those accounts are strictly managed. Only my financial director has access to authorize those kinds of transfers." Frederick stopped mid-sentence, the realization hitting him like physical force. Simone had access. Simone had authorization. Simone had been managing these accounts for 18 months, while Frederick had been too distracted, building his image and destroying his marriage, to notice patterns that should have raised immediate red flags. "Where is Miss Simone Caraway?" Patricia asked, her tone suggesting the question wasn't casual curiosity. "I'll find her." Frederick stood, his movements sharp, with barely controlled panic. Simone wasn't at her desk, wasn't in the building, wasn't answering her phone or responding to messages that grew increasingly urgent as Frederick's understanding of the situation crystallized into something close to catastrophe. He called his lawyer, called his accountant, called every board member with growing desperation as the scope of Simone's theft emerged from documents she'd carefully curated to hide exactly what she'd been doing. She'd stolen systematically methodically, with the kind of precision that suggested experience. Small amounts at first, testing security protocols, then larger sums as she understood where the gaps existed, where oversight failed, where Frederick's trust had created vulnerability. The total, when finally calculated, approached $700,000. Not enough to destroy Frederick completely, but enough to crack foundations, trigger investigations, raise questions among investors about competency and security, and whether Leonard Industries was a reliable place to entrust capital. Frederick sat in his office long after everyone else had left, staring at financial statements that revealed his own stupidity in clinical detail. He'd been so focused on image, on appearing successful, on surrounding himself with attractive competence, that he'd never actually verified that competence was real. He'd chosen Simone because she made him look good, because having her beside him suggested virility, relevance, power, because Barbara had made him feel ordinary and Simone had made him feel exceptional. And he'd valued exceptional over honest, without considering that exceptional people rarely waste time making mediocre men feel important. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You taught me everything, Frederick. Take what you want when you want it, from whoever's too weak to stop you. Thank you for the education. And the money?" Frederick threw his phone across the office, watched it shatter against the wall, and understood with brutal clarity that he'd been played by someone who'd learned manipulation from watching him practice it on others. The lawsuit started within days. Clients whose money Simone had stolen demanding restitution. Investors panicking about security vulnerabilities and pulling funding. Board members calling emergency meetings where Frederick's competence was questioned with increasing bluntness. Jonathan Richards, who'd been Frederick's friend before becoming his colleague, spoke with careful diplomacy that barely masked contempt. "We need to discuss contingency plans if this situation escalates. The board is concerned about leadership stability." "I'm handling it," Frederick insisted, his voice carrying defensiveness he couldn't quite suppress. Simone acted alone. "This is contained." "Is it?" David Patterson leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Because from where I'm sitting, this looks like systematic oversight failure. The kind that makes people wonder what else we're not seeing." The meeting deteriorated from there, polite concerns evolving into pointed criticisms. Frederick's authority eroding in real time as men who'd followed his leadership began questioning whether that leadership had ever been sound. He left the boardroom feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine fear. Not worry about appearance or reputation, but actual fear that everything he'd built might collapse. That the empire he'd sacrificed his family to create was built on foundations as hollow as his relationships. The phone calls from friends, people he'd called friends, stopped coming. Invitations to galas and golf outings dried up. The professional network he'd cultivated revealed itself to be transactional, built on success rather than loyalty. And success in question made him a liability better avoided. Gerald Foster, who'd always laughed loudest at Frederick's jokes, declined dinner plans with an excuse so transparent it barely qualified as polite. Claire Richards stopped returning Barbara's, no, not Barbara's. Those were Frederick's calls now, stopped returning his calls entirely. Frederick discovered that social capital evaporated faster than financial capital, and he was losing both simultaneously. He tried calling Barbara once, late at night, whiskey brave and desperate for the kind of support she used to provide without being asked. His finger hovered over her contact, the one he hadn't deleted, because deleting it would mean admitting she was gone permanently. And after 30 seconds of hovering, he chickened out, set the phone down, and poured another drink instead. She wouldn't help him. Why would she? He'd destroyed her publicly, dismissed her contributions, treated her like an embarrassing relic of a life he'd outgrown. She owed him nothing, and he couldn't bring himself to beg from the woman he'd scorned. Pride, even in collapse, was a stubborn companion. The investigation expanded. Authorities got involved, asked questions Frederick couldn't answer, implied incompetence he couldn't refute. His lawyers worked overtime on damage control, their billable hours adding to mounting financial pressure that grew heavier daily. Frederick's sleep became fractured, broken by anxiety and the particular insomnia that comes from understanding you're drowning without knowing how to swim. He'd wake at 3 in the morning in a cold sweat, mind racing through scenarios of complete financial ruin, professional disgrace, the total collapse of everything he'd sacrificed his family to build. One night, unable to sleep, he drove past the community center where Barbara taught. He didn't plan to, didn't consciously choose the route. But somehow, his car ended up parked across the street, watching lights in basement windows, wondering if she was in there, wondering if she ever thought about him, wondering if she'd heard about his unraveling and felt vindication or indifference or something he couldn't name because emotions had become foreign territory. Child emerged from the center with a woman Frederick didn't recognize. Their faces lit by warm light from inside, their body language speaking of connection and care. The woman hugged the child goodbye, and Frederick felt something twist in his chest, not jealousy exactly, but a recognition of intimacy he'd traded away for cold professional relationships that dissolved under pressure. He drove home to his mansion that felt larger and emptier every day, filled with furniture he'd bought to impress people who'd stopped visiting, decorated with art, selected by designers paid to make him look cultured rather than feel anything. Frederick poured whiskey into glasses expensive enough to be meaningless, sat in his study, surrounded by awards and accolades that suddenly felt hollow, and stared at the one photograph he hadn't removed, his wedding photo, buried under papers on a shelf he rarely accessed. Young Barbara smiled at young Frederick in that picture, both of them glowing with hopes neither had realized would curdle into resentment and regret. He looked at that photo, at the man he'd been before ambition had transformed him into someone capable of cruelty disguised as success, and wondered when exactly he'd decided that becoming impressive mattered more than remaining decent. The answer was obvious, even if he couldn't quite articulate it. The moment he'd realized he could, power hadn't corrupted him suddenly. It had revealed who he was when no one could stop him, when consequences seemed abstract, when the people who loved him could be dismissed because they loved him without conditions he needed to meet. Frederick set the photo face down on his desk, unable to look at it anymore, unable to face the man he'd been or the man he'd become. Outside, the city continued its evening routines, people living lives that didn't revolve around his crisis. And somewhere across town, Barbara was probably reading, Precious a bedtime story, or helping Elias with homework, or existing in the quiet contentment of a life built on love instead of leverage. Frederick drank until the whiskey numbed his thoughts, until sleep became possible, even if rest remained elusive, and understood with devastating clarity that he was facing the consequences of choices he'd made deliberately, enthusiastically, without considering that all bills eventually come due. The empire he'd built was cracking, and he had no idea how to stop the fractures from spreading. But collapse, like growth, follows its own timeline, and Frederick's fall had only just begun. Chapter 7. Parallel Worlds. By the time Rosefield Learning Center celebrated its 3rd anniversary with 180 students, a waiting list, and a city commendation, Frederick Leonard was celebrating nothing. He was drowning in a silence so loud it screamed his failures. Barbara stood in front of Rosefield's renovated building, transformed from abandoned warehouse into functional educational space through grant funding and community belief. The sign above the entrance read, Rosefield Academy, where every child matters. And Barbara felt pride that can't be purchased, only earned through daily dedication. The anniversary celebration filled the space with students, parents, and teachers. Children performed songs from music classes that hadn't existed before. Elias, now confident and honorable, greeted families at the entrance. He'd enrolled in community college, studying education policy, and worked part-time at Rosefield coordinating programs. Precious led tours of the art studio she'd helped design, demonstrating leadership that came from service rather than dominance. Barbara moved through the celebration, accepting congratulations with grace, deflecting praise to her team and community. She'd been featured on local television, interviewed about community-driven education models. A reporter approached. "Mrs. Norris, Rosefield has grown exponentially. What do you attribute that success to?" We succeed because we show up every day for every child. We've built trust by being trustworthy. Everything else follows from that foundation." The celebration ended with Rosefield's student choir performing, their voices genuine if imperfect, and Barbara understood this was success that actually mattered. Meanwhile, across the city, Frederick packed boxes in a one-bedroom apartment that smelled like someone else's cooking and felt like failure. The mansion had been foreclosed, cars repossessed, furniture auctioned to pay debts that kept multiplying. Leonard Industries sold to satisfy creditors. Frederick's apartment was the kind of place he'd have mocked before: thin walls, broken cabinets, worn carpet. He owned almost nothing now: clothes, a laptop, a few books. Everything else converted to cash for mistakes that kept compounding. He worked in a cubicle at a consulting firm that hired him because they paid poorly enough that desperation outweighed dignity. His boss was younger, smarter, and treated him with courtesy that barely masked contempt. He ate lunch at his desk, discount sandwiches, and walked to work because car ownership was luxury he couldn't afford. His health declined. Blood pressure spiked. Panic attacks ambushed him randomly. Insomnia became constant. Frederick saw a therapist because his doctor insisted. Dr. Rivers listened more than she spoke and refused to let Frederick blame external factors. "You talk about Simone stealing from you, but you don't talk about what you stole from your family." "I didn't steal. You took their time and gave back absence. You took their support and returned criticism. That's theft. Mr. Leonard, you stole years they'll never get back and convinced yourself that providing financially meant you didn't owe them emotionally." The words hit harder than any financial loss. Frederick wanted to argue but couldn't because Dr. Rivers was right. He left therapy feeling worse, which Dr. Rivers called progress. Uncomfortable means you're confronting truth. Frederick drove past Rosefield Academy one night, maybe intentionally, maybe not. The building glowed with evening activity. He parked across the street, watching Barbara move past windows. She looked content, settled, purposeful. She laughed at something, threw her head back in genuine amusement, and Frederick felt jealousy so sharp it hurt. Jealousy of the man she'd once laughed with before he'd killed joy through neglect. Elias appeared beside Barbara, then Precious carrying artwork. They were a family without him, complete, thriving, unburdened by his absence, possibly improved by it. He'd been surgically removed like cancer, and they'd healed. Frederick sat in his used sedan and let himself feel grief. Not for what he'd lost, but for what he'd destroyed deliberately. He cried for the first time since childhood, messy and undignified, stripped of every defense against vulnerability. When tears stopped, he wiped his eyes with his sleeve, no pocket square, just a shirt worn too many times between washings. He drove home, climbed creaking stairs, and stood in his nearly empty living room, understanding this was rock bottom. The only choice left was whether to stay drowning or start learning to swim. Frederick searched for support groups, not networking. Support groups for people rebuilding after collapse, for humans who destroyed their lives and needed community. He found one. Tuesday nights at a church basement. Rebuilding after loss, all welcome, no judgment. Frederick stared at the screen for 20 minutes before marking himself as interested. It wasn't redemption, just acknowledgement that he needed help. that maybe learning to be different required admitting the old person had failed catastrophically. Across town, Barbara tucked Precious into bed, listened to her daughter's day with the openness that comes from feeling safe and loved. She found Elias making tea, a habit inherited from her. "Good day," he asked. "Really good. How's your research paper?" "Almost done. About educational equity. Inspired by Rosefield," Barbara smiled. "I'm proud of you. Not for grades, but for choosing to build instead of take. You taught me that by living it." They sat in comfortable silence, survivors who'd rebuilt themselves stronger, and Barbara felt gratitude for the life she'd chosen, despite what it cost. She'd learned to live without luxury, without status, without a partner who valued only what she provided, and discovered she could live beautifully, meaningfully, joyfully, not despite loss, but because of it. Some lessons cost everything to learn, but some lessons are worth the price. Chapter 8. The Bottom Has No Doors. Frederick Leonard hit rock bottom and discovered it had no doors. No windows, no exits marked redemption, just mirrors everywhere he looked, reflecting a man he no longer recognized and wasn't sure he could rebuild. The church basement smelled like old coffee and honest desperation. 12 folding chairs in a circle, each occupied by someone who'd learned pride, comes before falls nobody photographs. Men mostly, a few women, all wearing expressions, suggesting they'd rather be anywhere else but had run out of elsewheres. Frederick arrived early. Now took a seat near the back, avoided eye contact with other early arrivals, equally committed to invisibility. An older man entered, weathered but with kind eyes that had seen too much and still chose kindness. "Welcome, everyone. I'm Thomas. I facilitate these meetings, but I'm also just another person trying to figure out how to live with damage I've caused. Let's go around the circle. Share your name, whatever brought you here. No judgment, no advice unless requested." They went around. Richard, whose gambling cost him his family. Maria, who'd prioritized career until she woke up successful and alone. James, whose anger drove everyone away. Each person spoke with raw honesty that made Frederick's chest tight. When the circle reached him, Frederick's mouth went dry. "I'm Frederick. He stalled, pride fighting visibility even here. "Take your time," Thomas said gently. "I destroyed my marriage," Frederick finally said. "My wife was the foundation of everything I built, every success she made possible. And I treated her like she was worthless because I convinced myself success meant I'd outgrown her. I humiliated her publicly, gaslit her privately. My kids went with her, which they should have, because I was a terrible father and worse husband. I told myself providing money meant I didn't owe them time or respect." The group listened without interrupting, giving Frederick space to speak things he'd never articulated. Now everything's gone. The business collapsed. My friends disappeared. I lost everything I thought defined me. And the worst part is I deserve all of it. Every consequence. Because I chose this. I chose ego over love, image over integrity, and destroyed people who'd done nothing except believe in me. Thomas spoke first. "Thank you for that honesty, Frederick. That takes courage." Richard nodded. "The hardest part is living with what you did when you can't undo it." "Do they know you're trying to change?" Maria asked. Frederick shook his head. "No, and they shouldn't have to know. They've moved on. I don't have any right to intrude. Change isn't about earning forgiveness," James said. "It's about becoming someone different, regardless of whether anyone witnesses it." Frederick attended every Tuesday meeting after that. Showed up even when he didn't want to, especially then. Because showing up when difficult was how you built different habits. He started journaling, letters to Barbara, Elias and Precious he never sent but needed to write. Apologies that couldn't fix anything but articulated understanding of what he'd broken. "Dear Barbara," he wrote one night, "I don't know if you think about me anymore. You probably don't. Why would you? But I think about you constantly. About the woman who worked 2 jobs so I could finish my certifications. About nights you helped me prepare presentations because you believed in me. About how I repaid your faith by deciding you were beneath me. I wish I could tell you I've changed. But change measured in months means nothing against damage measured in years. I'm trying, not for you, you don't owe me anything, but for myself, because living as the person I became is unbearable. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to say you were right about everything, and I was wrong about all of it. Frederick, he folded the letter, tucked it into his journal, knowing he'd never send it because sending would force Barbara to process feelings she'd probably moved past. Therapy with Dr. Rivers became spaces where Frederick confronted inherited patterns. His father had measured love in financial provision, worked constantly, been emotionally absent. Frederick had absorbed that lesson completely without questioning it. Your father did the best he could with the tools he had, Dr. Rivers said. But you don't have to use the same tools. How do I build differently when I've already destroyed everything? Build for yourself first. Become someone whose company you can tolerate. The rest follows, or it doesn't. Frederick began volunteering at a food distribution center on Saturdays, not for image rehabilitation, but because the work was physical and immediate. He loaded boxes, sorted donations, carried bags for elderly people who'd lived harder lives and complained less. A woman named Gladys worked beside him most Saturdays, sorting canned goods with practiced efficiency. Elderly, wrinkled, wearing mended clothes. She smiled genuinely at everyone, remembered names, asked about grandchildren. "You're new to this," Gladys observed one Saturday. "Yeah, trying to figure some things out." "Figured anything out yet?" Frederick considered lying, but something about Gladys made dishonesty impossible. "Just that I wasted a lot of years being someone I shouldn't have been." "Well," Gladys said, handing him another box, "at least you figured it out while you still got years left to be someone different. Some folks never get that far." Her words stuck with Frederick longer than therapy insights. Maybe transformation wasn't dramatic change, but incremental shifts, daily choices to be marginally better. Understanding consistency mattered more than intensity. He stopped checking social media, cancelled subscriptions to magazines he'd only read to feel cultured, deleted apps designed to make him feel inadequate through comparison. He simplified existence to essentials: work, therapy, support group, volunteering, sleep when possible. His apartment remained sparse by choice now. He didn't accumulate possessions because they no longer felt like proof of worth. He owned what he needed, and discovered simplicity created space for thoughts instead of distractions. One evening, walking home, Frederick saw a flyer, Rosefield Academy Open House, community welcome. His first instinct was to avoid it. His second was to attend anonymously, observe from distance. His third, informed by months of therapy, was to recognize both impulses as selfishness, one rooted in shame, one in curiosity, neither about respecting boundaries. He didn't go to the open house. Instead, he wrote another unsent letter. "Dear Elias and Precious, I saw there's an open house at your school. I won't attend because my presence would make everything about me instead of you, and I've already made too many things about me. I just wanted to say, though you'll never read this, that I'm proud of you. Not meaningless pride of someone who contributed nothing, but aching pride of someone recognizing the people you've become happened despite my absence. You've become genuinely good people, the kind I pretended to be raising. I hope you're happy. I hope you never doubt your worth the way I made your mother doubt hers. Your father, who's trying to earn the right to call himself that again someday, even if someday never comes." Frederick folded that letter beside all the others. Evidence that he'd felt what he'd refused to feel. Remorse, accountability, the terrible weight of understanding exactly what he'd destroyed. Rock bottom wasn't a moment. It was a process that left you with nothing except the choice to stay demolished or start building something different from rubble. Frederick chose building, even though the blueprint was unclear. even though he had no guarantee building would lead anywhere except more honest versions of the same loneliness. But honest loneliness felt more survivable than dishonest connection. So he survived. One Tuesday meeting at a time, one therapy session at a time, one Saturday morning at a time, accumulating days where he didn't actively make things worse, and calling that progress because progress was all he had left to measure. Chapter 9. The Distance That Defines. 18 months after Barbara walked out of his life, Frederick Leonard had rebuilt nothing material, owned nothing impressive, and mattered to no one outside his support group, and for the first time in his entire existence, he understood that anonymity might be the truest measure of freedom. Seasons changed without fanfare in Frederick's small world. He marked time by therapy appointments and support group meetings rather than quarterly reports. He'd become unremarkable, just another middle-aged man riding the bus to a job that paid enough to survive. Anonymous in crowds, forgotten in moments. His consulting firm promoted him slightly, not because he was exceptional, but because he showed up consistently. The raise was modest, enough to afford slightly better groceries and a winter coat that didn't leak cold. Frederick accepted the promotion with quiet gratitude rather than ego. He'd stopped stalking Barbara's world through social media, stopped measuring his worth against her achievements. The discipline required was significant. His fingers still itched to type her name during weak moments. His brain defaulted to wondering what she was doing. But he resisted, understanding that monitoring her life was another variation of control, another way of inserting himself into a story he'd written himself out of deliberately. His support group had become the closest thing Frederick had to community. These broken people meeting weekly, confessing failures and celebrating tiny victories, witnessing each other's attempts at transformation, they understood him in ways his professional network never had. Solidarity in damage created bonds stronger than shared success ever had. Thomas pulled Frederick aside after one meeting. "You've been coming for over a year now. How's the work going?" "Slow," Frederick admitted. "Most days I wake up ashamed of who I was. Some days I'm ashamed of who I still am." "That's called conscience," Thomas said. "Uncomfortable but necessary. The day shame stops motivating change, you've probably stopped trying. Do you think people can actually change? Fundamentally change? Or do we just become better at hiding who we really are?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I think we're always who we are at our core. But that core can expand to include new ways of being if we're willing to do the work. You're not going to stop being Frederick Leonard, but you can become a version who learned from mistakes instead of repeating them. Whether that constitutes fundamental change, does the distinction matter if the outcome is you're less harmful?" The question lingered with Frederick long after the meeting ended. He volunteered additional hours at the food distribution center. Gladys had become something like a friend, if friendship could exist between two people who only knew each other through Saturday morning service. "You've got somewhere to be for the holidays?" Gladys asked one December morning. "Not really. Just me and a quiet apartment." Gladys studied him. "That's loneliness talking. You know you're welcome to join community dinner at the church. Always room for one more." Frederick felt something tighten in his chest, gratitude mixed with unworthiness. "Thank you. I'll think about it." He didn't attend, choosing solitude over imposing his presence on people whose warmth he didn't deserve. He spent the holiday alone, eating takeout, and allowed himself to feel the full weight of isolation he'd created through choices made deliberately. This was the life he'd built. Not the one he'd intended, but the one his actions had constructed. Owning that without flinching felt like the only honest thing left to do. Frederick saw the announcement by accident, a flyer on the bus advertising Rosefield Academy's Community Appreciation event. The invitation extended to everyone who supported our mission. He wasn't everyone who supported their mission. He was the person who'd tried to destroy the woman who'd created it. He had no business anywhere near that event. no right to occupy space in rooms celebrating achievements he'd actively worked against. Frederick folded the flyer, placed it in his pocket, and spent the next week deliberately not looking at it, not thinking about it, not fantasizing about showing up. He went to therapy instead. "I saw that there's an event at Barbara's school," he told Dr. Rivers. "My first instinct was to find a way to attend without being noticed. Watch my kids, see what Barbara's built. But I realized that showing up, even anonymously, would center me in their story again. They've built something that has nothing to do with me. Inserting myself even as an observer violates that separateness." Dr. Rivers nodded. "That's growth, Frederick. Recognizing that love sometimes looks like absence, that respecting boundaries matters more than satisfying curiosity." "It doesn't feel like growth," Frederick said bitterly. "It feels like punishment, like I'm condemned to wonder about them forever, to care about people who rightfully don't want me caring." "Maybe that's what accountability looks like," Dr. Rivers suggested gently. "Not punishment, but natural consequence. You damage people significantly. They remove themselves. You don't get to decide when or if they return. Your work is becoming someone who wouldn't damage them again if they did, knowing they probably won't." The truth carved itself into Frederick's consciousness. Uncomfortable and unavoidable, he didn't go to the appreciation event, didn't drive past the school. He stayed home, went to work, attended his support group, volunteered his Saturdays, and existed in the small circumference of a life he was slowly rebuilding. Richard from support group called him unexpectedly one evening. "Hey man, few of us are getting together for coffee tomorrow. Thought you might want to join." The invitation surprised Frederick, community extending beyond scheduled meetings. "Yeah, I'd like that." They met at a diner that served strong coffee and grandmother recipe pie. Frederick sat with Richard, James, and Maria, listening to them talk about jobs and struggles and small victories, and realized this was fellowship he'd never experienced during his success days. These people didn't care about his former status or current shame. They just accepted him as another person trying to survive the damage they'd caused. "You've been quiet," Maria observed. "Everything okay?" Frederick stirred his coffee. "Just thinking about how much time I wasted building a life that looked impressive instead of one that felt meaningful. You all are the closest thing I have to friends, and I met you by admitting I destroyed everything." "There's something darkly funny about that." "Nothing dark about it," James said. "We trust each other because we've all admitted we're capable of damage. That's more honest than whatever pretend friendships exist between people pretending to be perfect." They stayed for hours, talking and laughing and existing in authentic connection, and Frederick felt something he'd almost forgotten: belonging. Not performative belonging, but genuine acceptance. He walked home through winter streets, cold air burning his lungs, and felt something like peace. Not happiness. He wasn't sure he deserved happiness, but peace in knowing he was doing the work of transformation without guarantee of reward. Frederick passed the church where his support group met, remembered Thomas's words about change being more important than redemption. He didn't need Barbara or Elias or Precious to forgive him for his work to matter. He needed to become someone whose absence from their lives was a gift rather than a deprivation. He returned to his apartment, pulled out his journal and wrote one final unsent letter. "I won't write any more after this, not because I don't think about you, I do constantly, but because these letters have become about me processing my guilt rather than genuinely caring about your well-being. You deserve better than being supporting characters in my redemption narrative. You deserve to exist completely separate from my journey. I hope you're happy. I hope you've forgotten me except as a cautionary tale. I hope your lives are so full of love and purpose that I'm nothing except an occasional memory of what to avoid becoming. Be happy, be free. That's my final wish, and then I'm letting go. Frederick." He closed the journal, placed it in a drawer, and meant it when he said he wouldn't write more. Some stories don't get neat endings. Some relationships don't resolve into forgiveness. Some people have to live with being the villain in someone else's story, and growth means accepting that without demanding absolution. Frederick was learning to live in that space, not heroically, just persistently, one difficult day after another. Becoming someone different, not because different guaranteed better outcomes, but because staying the same guaranteed continued harm. The night of Rosefield's appreciation event arrived. Frederick stayed home, ate dinner alone, watched television he didn't care about, and resisted every impulse to drive past the school. He went to bed early, slept fitfully, woke to another ordinary day, and understood that this was accountability, not dramatic consequences. Just the quiet absence of people who rightfully wanted nothing to do with him, and the work of becoming someone different without promise that different would ever matter to anyone except himself. Across town, Barbara stood in Rosefield Academy's main hall, surrounded by community, by students, by tangible evidence of what love built, and she never once thought about the man who tried to convince her she was worthless. She'd moved so far beyond his damage that he'd become irrelevant, and that irrelevance was the greatest possible outcome, not for Frederick's sake, but for hers. Some endings are defined by presence, others by absence so complete it becomes its own form of closure. Frederick was learning to live in that absence, to make peace with irrelevance, to understand that transformation without witness might be the purest kind. And though he didn't know it yet, that understanding would soon be tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. But tonight, he simply existed, separate, silent, working on change nobody would see, and discovering that invisible growth might be the only kind that actually mattered. Chapter 10. The Rain That Washes Nothing Clean. Barbara Norris stood at Rosefield Academy's main entrance as the last guests left the appreciation night, rain drumming against the windows, and she felt the weight of Frederick's final letter in her pocket like a stone, not because it moved her, but because it forced her to decide whether some ruins deserved to be revisited. The letter had arrived 3 weeks ago. No return address, just Frederick's handwriting she'd recognize anywhere, even after years of separation. She'd read it once, folded it carefully, and carried it since, not from sentimentality, but from the burden of knowing someone was changing without owing them acknowledgement of that change. "I won't write any more after this," the letter had said, and something about the finality had felt genuine in ways his previous apologies never had. Not asking for forgiveness, not demanding attention, just releasing her from the obligation of caring about his transformation, which paradoxically made her care just slightly, just enough to wonder if people actually changed or just learned better performances. The appreciation event had been beautiful. Students performed music they'd composed themselves. Parents spoke testimonials about children who discovered confidence through education. Teachers shared stories of breakthrough moments when struggling kids suddenly understood they were capable of more than survival. The entire evening proved what Barbara had built through consistency and care, something that couldn't collapse because it wasn't held up by ego, just by daily commitment to showing up for people who needed someone to show up. Elias and Precious helped clean up now, stacking chairs and collecting discarded programs. They moved with practiced efficiency, these remarkable humans who'd chosen love over luxury and built themselves into people Barbara would admire, even if they weren't hers. Elias had been accepted to graduate programs for education policy. Precious had scholarship offers for art and design. They were launching into lives they'd built despite Frederick's absence, not because of any contribution he'd made. Thunder cracked overhead, the kind that shakes buildings and reminds humans they're small. Rain intensified from steady to torrential, turning streets into rivers, creating weather that demanded staying inside until storms passed. Barbara glanced through the window and froze. A figure stood across the street, soaked completely, not seeking shelter, just standing in the downpour, staring at the building. She couldn't make out features through rain and distance, but something about the posture, shoulders hunched not from cold, but from carrying weight, stillness that suggested he'd been there a while, made recognition impossible to avoid. Frederick. Her first instinct was anger. He'd promised in his letter to stay away, to release them from his orbit, and here he was, violating that promise like he'd violated every other. Her second instinct was to ignore him completely, let him stand in the rain until hypothermia made him leave, because she owed him nothing, not acknowledgement, not conversation, not even the dignity of being seen. Her third instinct, quieter but more insistent, was something she couldn't quite name. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just the faint echo of the question Dr. Rivers would ask, what kind of woman do you want to be? The one who turns away from suffering because it's deserved, or the one who witnesses it because that's who she chooses to be? Verdi. Your father is outside, Barbara said quietly to Elias and Precious, her voice cutting through their clean-up rhythm. Both children froze. Precious moved to the window, saw the figure, and her expression hardened immediately. Why is he here? I don't know. Barbara studied her children's faces, reading anger and hurt, and the particular betrayal of someone breaking promises. You don't owe him anything. Not your time, not your presence, not even acknowledgement. But he's out there in the rain, and I need to decide what kind of person I am. Elias's jaw tightened. Witnessing doesn't mean welcoming him back. I know. If you go out there, Precious added, her voice small and fierce simultaneously, we're coming with you. We're not letting him hurt you again. Barbara felt her chest constrict with love for these protectors she'd raised, these children who'd become her shield. Then we go together. But we set the terms. We control the boundaries. He doesn't get to dictate anything anymore. They walked out into the rain, as a unit, Barbara flanked by Elias and Precious, a family forged through survival presenting a united front. The cold hit immediately, rain soaking through clothes within seconds, but none of them retreated. Frederick saw them coming. He didn't move closer, didn't speak first, just stood there shivering and smaller than Barbara remembered, like collapse had physically diminished him. They stopped 12 feet away. That distance feeling important, necessary. The space that said, we're listening, but you're not welcome closer. Rain pounded between them, creating sound that made intimacy impossible, which suited everyone perfectly. Barbara spoke first, her voice cutting through the storm. You sent a letter saying you wouldn't intrude anymore. Frederick nodded, water streaming down his face, impossible to distinguish from tears if tears were present. I know, I meant it when I wrote it. I wasn't planning to come here. I didn't, his voice broke. I just needed to see the building. See what you built. I wasn't going to make contact. I was just going to look and leave. But you stayed, Elias said, his tone accusatory. You stood here getting soaked instead of respecting the boundaries you claimed to understand. You're right. Frederick didn't defend himself, didn't argue. I should have left the moment I saw the lights on. Should have never come at all. I'm sorry. I'll go now. He turned to leave, but Barbara's voice stopped him. Wait. Frederick turned back, hope flickering across his face before he suppressed it, like hoping for anything from them felt obscene. I need to understand something, Barbara said. Are you here because you've changed, or because you need us to validate that you've changed? Because if it's the second thing, you can leave now. Frederick stood silent for a long moment, rain the only sound between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the storm. I thought I'd changed enough that seeing you happy wouldn't destroy me. I was wrong. Watching through that window, seeing you all together, successful, thriving without me, it didn't make me feel proud. It made me realize how much I needed you just to stand at all. How without you I was hollow, am hollow. I'm not here because I've changed, Barbara. I'm here because I finally understand what I destroyed, and that understanding is unbearable. That's called consequence, Barbara said, her voice hard but not cruel. You built your palace on pride, Frederick. I built my world on love, and love never abandoned me even when you did. Especially when you did. Precious stepped forward slightly, rain plastering her hair to her face, her eyes holding wisdom beyond her years. Daddy, We don't forget what you did. Every day, we carry the memory of you telling Mama she wasn't good enough, of you choosing everything except us. But Mama taught us that people can grow if they choose to hurt less and love more. So I'll ask you directly, have you chosen that? Or are you just sad about losing things you took for granted? The question hung in the rain-soaked air, brutal in its honesty. Frederick looked at his daughter, this child he'd tried to bribe with European vacations, who'd chosen her mother over his money, and his face crumpled with genuine anguish. I don't know if I've changed enough to matter. I know I'm different than I was. I know I see what I did clearly now. How I weaponized your mother's love, how I taught you that worth came from wealth. I know I was monstrous in ways I called success. But knowing and changing, those aren't the same thing. And I don't expect you to witness my attempts or validate my effort. I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to become someone worthy of being in the same room as your respect. Not your love, not your forgiveness, just your respect. Even though I know I'll probably never earn it. Elias spoke then, his voice colder than Precious's. You don't get to decide when you've earned it. We do. And right now, standing in the rain making dramatic speeches that feels performative. Dad, like you're trying to emotional leverage us into saying you're forgiven so you can stop feeling guilty. You're right, Frederick said immediately. You're absolutely right. This is selfish. My presence here is selfish. Everything I do is still somehow about me, even when I'm trying to make it about you. I don't know how to be better than that yet. I'm trying and failing. And I'm sorry for failing in front of you again. Thunder crashed overhead, lightning illuminating their faces in stark white flashes that made the moment feel biblical, consequential, like nature itself was bearing witness. Barbara felt something shift inside her, not forgiveness, but the faint possibility of something adjacent to it. Not reconciliation, but the recognition that this broken man in the rain was genuinely trying. Even if trying poorly, and that witnessing his effort didn't obligate her to anything except choosing what kind of person she wanted to be. This isn't reconciliation, Barbara said finally, her voice carrying over the storm. This isn't even the beginning of one. This is me choosing to witness that you're trying without owing you access to what we've built. You're allowed to watch from a distance, Frederick, to know we're doing well. To understand that we survived your damage and became stronger because of it. But you're not entitled to proximity. You're not owed our time or emotional energy. We've moved beyond you so completely that you're not even a wound anymore, just a scar we forget about until weather makes it ache. Frederick nodded, water and what might have been tears mixing on his face. I understand. Do you? Elias challenged. Because understanding means accepting that maybe we never want more than this. Maybe this moment in the rain is all you get. No coffee dates in a few years. No gradual rebuilding. Just us acknowledging you exist and then walking away. Can you accept that? I have to, Frederick whispered. Because the alternative is demanding things from you that you don't owe me. And I'm trying very hard not to be that person anymore. Precious surprised everyone by stepping forward, closing half the distance between them. Maybe in a long time, if you keep showing up for yourself the way you should have shown up for us, maybe we can be civil, distant but not hostile. That's the most I can imagine right now, and even that feels generous. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't hope. It was the thinnest acknowledgement that transformation was possible without being guaranteed, and that possibility didn't require her participation. Barbara turned to leave, then stopped. She reached into her pocket, pulled out Frederick's letter, and held it out toward him. You said you wouldn't write anymore. Keep that promise. We don't need updates on your progress. We don't need to be characters in your redemption story. You're welcome to become better, Frederick. But we're not your teachers anymore. That work is yours alone. Frederick didn't take the letter. Keep it, destroy it, whatever you need. I meant every word, including the part about letting you go completely. Barbara nodded once, pocketed the letter again, and turned toward Rosefield's entrance. Elias and Precious followed immediately, forming their protective unit again, leaving Frederick standing alone in the rain. They walked back into warmth and light, back into the world they'd built without him, and the door closed softly behind them, not with the slam of anger, but the quiet certainty of boundaries held. Frederick stood in the rain until he couldn't feel his fingers, until hypothermia threatened, until staying longer would be self-harm disguised as penance. Then he walked to the bus stop, rode home to his small apartment, and understood that this was the rest of his life, loving people from distance, respecting boundaries he'd destroyed, carrying damage he'd caused without demanding those he'd damaged help him carry it. He would spend years proving he meant his words, never knowing if those years would matter. And perhaps that uncertainty was the point. Transformation without guarantee, growth without witness. Becoming different, not because someone was watching, but because staying the same felt like choosing death. Barbara didn't watch him leave. She was already helping Elias and Precious finish cleanup, discussing breakfast plans, laughing about something small and meaningless, existing as a family, not defined by what they'd survived, but by what they'd chosen to build after survival. The rain washed the streets clean that night, but some stains run deeper than water reaches. And perhaps that's the truest ending, not redemption, not reunion, just the quiet dignity of people learning to carry their damage without letting it carry them, choosing who they become despite who they were, and understanding that some distances never close because closing them would require sacrificing boundaries that keep us whole. Barbara locked Rosefield's doors that night and drove her children home through rain that eventually stopped, through streets that eventually dried into a future that belonged entirely to them, unburdened by ghosts, unencumbered by men who'd forgotten that love was verb before it was noun. Free in ways freedom only exists when you've survived losing everything and discovered you still have yourself. And that, Barbara understood as she tucked Precious into bed and hugged Elias goodnight and lay down in her own room in the house she'd earned, was the greatest success possible, not building an empire, but building a life where love was action, where showing up mattered more than impressing, where the people you loved knew they mattered, not because you said it, but because you proved it daily through choices that prioritized their dignity over your comfort. Frederick. Leonard learned that lesson too late to matter to the people he'd hurt, but he learned it, and whether that learning mattered to anyone except himself would remain uncertain for the rest of his life. Some questions don't get answered. Some endings don't resolve. Some people have to live in the space between knowing better and being better, and growth means accepting that discomfort as permanent residence. The rain stopped. The night ended, and two separate worlds continued parallel, one built on love that lasted, one built on lessons learned too late, never intersecting again, never needing to, both existing as proof that who we become is always a choice, even when that choice comes after we've destroyed everything we should have cherished.